everyone, and welcome back to our English literature videos. So, in this period we are talking about modernism. We talked about James Joyce, about Virginia Woolf. Today we are talking about a poet. Probably the most representative poet of modernism together with Yeats. And I'm talking about Thomas Stearns Eliot. Thomas Stearns Eliot, he wasn't English, he wasn't British at first because he was born in America. He was American, he was born in 1888 in St. Louis in Missouri. And he was educated at Harvard first, then the Sorbonne, and then again in Oxford. And then he settled in England during the First World War. He worked there as a bank clerk and as a publisher. Well, his first works were already very mature and very representative of his time, and one of his first works was probably his masterpiece, which is The Waste Land, published in 1922. Extremely representative, extremely symbolic, extremely complex. We'll see what I'm talking about. But we have also to remember another important event in his life. In 1927, he joined the Anglican Church. It happened after a long period of tormented religious and spiritual research. And after his decision to join the Anglican Church, he also wrote some works which are extremely famous and extremely deep as far as this aspect is concerned, and they are, for example, Hollow Man, published in 1925, and Journey of the Magi, in 1927. Now, it's interesting that in this period he also renounced his American citizenship and he became British, he became a British subject. It's also very interesting to remember that his literature was so multifaceted, so complex, and there was a huge variety of contexts and styles, and so he also wrote some poems for children, especially there is one very popular book, of children's poems, and its title is Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats. It was published in 1939 and it will be adapted to the very successful and very popular musical Cats, So, talking in general about his works, we can say that he focuses especially on poetry, obviously, on drama, and he also criticized, his criticism was also very well represented in some works, like for example The Sacred Hood, on the Notes were the definition of culture. He talked also a lot about modernism, and he explained, how an intellectual, how an author should interpret reality, Now I'm reading a quotation, that was written by him, and he talks here about poetry, the poetry that he wanted to represent, the poetry that Yeats represented at the time too. He said, "Our civilization comprehends great variety and complexity, and this variety and complexity, playing upon a refined sensibility, must produce various and complex results. The poet must become more and more comprehensive, more elusive, more indirect, in order to force, to dislocate, if necessary, language into its meaning." So this is very interesting because he talks about that variety and complexity. When we analyzed modernism in general, we talked about political background, we talked about the historical, cultural, economical, scientific background. And we talked about how multifaceted it was, full of contradictions somehow. Well, he talks about variety and complexity, and obviously he says that the art, has to be a mirror, okay, of this variety and complexity. And so, in order to represent this world, okay, the final result, so art, has to be, okay, has to represent this variety and complexity, okay. It cannot be different than this. It has to be a various and complex result, basically. So the poet must become, okay, it's not that he can become, he must become more and more comprehensive. So he has basically to perceive, to take, to somehow to collect, to express, okay, a wider and wider variety of contents, using a wider variety of styles too, okay. He has to become more elusive, more indirect, because he has to force language, okay, to force language in order to represent what he really means, basically, okay. So language has to be shaped in order to create the result that the author obviously wishes, okay, and that result has to be created, to develop inside the reader, basically. So, obviously this is extremely interesting and also new, but it also means a considerable obscurity, okay, for the reader, and sometimes also incomprehensibility, okay. It's very difficult to comprehend, to understand sometimes, and also because his literature is always possible, or it is always there to be read on many different levels, okay. We can think about his masterpiece The Wasteland, for example. There are so many different levels of interpretations, and there is obviously a narrative level, but there are so many different aspects. For example, okay, the plot here develops into 12 hours. We have mentioned the Ulysses by Joyce before, and we said that the Ulysses plays, okay, the plot lasts just one day, and same goes for Mrs. Dalloway, okay, for Mrs. Dalloway, written by Virginia Woolf, obviously. In this case, just 12 hours, but in this 12 hours, okay, there is an incredible resume of culture, of literature, of human history somehow. And it's no problem for him to put the Punic War and the situation in England in the 20th century together, okay. He can easily bridge the gap, okay. There is no clash in his work. This is extremely interesting. He put past and present together. He uses, we can say, so many different references. He uses monologue. We talked about monologue a lot, actually, especially talking about the Ulysses, but in general we know it's a very used technique during modernism, especially interior monologue. But he also uses dialogues, pieces of dialogues, okay, which are maybe memories or are used or taken from other moments, basically. And the poem is finally a web of references. It is a web of references and quotation from a variety of cultural sources, okay. He uses borrowed lines and myths, okay, ideas from mythology, and so his context is universalized, basically. There is another interesting quotation taken from tradition and the individual talent, okay, in which he said, in his view, obviously, the writer has to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with the feeling that the whole of the literature in Europe, from Homer and within it, the whole literature of his own century, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. This is extremely clear, okay? He says this very, very, very clearly. He says that basically the author here, or the artist in general, can't just leave his own moment and write something that is just we can say it's just linked, okay, to his own historical period, but he has to leave. It is interesting because he says that the writer has to write with not merely his own generation in his bones, okay, but in his bones he has to keep, okay, tradition and literature, okay, of Europe, and this traditional literature has to become sort of a resume, okay, of the history of the human being. This is extremely interesting too. Obviously, in order to do so, he also used different kinds of experimentation. Also metric experimentation. He used the irregular lines, irregular rhythms, and then obviously he used, as we said before, a combination of themes, and there are abrupt, quick changes, okay, in the contents and in the style too. For example, he uses on one side some you can say unusual or unreal images, and on the other side he uses everyday words, and sometimes they're not poetic at all, okay. So there are many aspects together, and the juxtaposition of different and opposite elements which are put together basically. Now it is also very interesting that Eliot for the first time used a technique, okay, and he also talked about this technique, and this technique is called objective-correlative, okay. We find it in other literatures too, like for example in Italian literature with Montale in his work Ossi di Seppia, okay, but the first writer, the first intellectual, the first artist that used this technique was Eliot, and he talked about it in an essay, Hamlet, written in 1919, and he explains exactly what objective-correlative is. He says that the only way of expressing emotion in the form of art, obviously, is by finding an objective correlative. In other words, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events, which shall be the formula of that particular emotion. So basically he is saying that the author, okay, the writer, isn't talking explicitly about emotions, about messages, or about feelings. He doesn't tell the reader what he has to feel, what he has to think, but the writer is describing things, forcing the language, as he said before, in order to create that emotion in the reader. Okay? So his task here is to be to use objects, so something that that doesn't belong, okay, to subjectivity, so objects, situations or events, all right? And what changes, okay, the result is the way he uses to describe them, okay? In that case, okay, that becomes there is a sort of this is why it's called correlative. There is a relation, okay, a relation to the emotion that has to be provoked, basically, okay. And so he uses language in order to describe things in a certain way, and he also used the subjectivity of the individual in order to feel that emotion, okay, that he wanted to provoke. But that subjectivity has also an objective part, okay, that belongs basically to the human being, okay, because describing one thing in a certain way, we are almost sure to create some some kind of a result, okay? So this is basically what the objective correlative is about. So describing and talking about something which is just apparently objective, but the way it is described creates also a feeling, an emotion, or anyway the author expects some emotions to be to develop, okay, inside the reader, inside his subjectivity, okay, while he is reading. So this is the process of creating precise poetic images, basically. So this kind of poetry was belonged completely to the avant-garde, okay, absolutely. Paradoxically, Eliot was extremely conservative as far as his idea about society were concerned. He believed in the importance of traditions, and also as far as literature is concerned, actually, in fact, he rejected completely the idea of the poet, of the romantic poet, which is connected to the ideal of the genius, of the poet prophet. He completely rejects this idea, okay? The poet, in this case, is an incredible intellectual, is an incredible artist who is able to be comprehensive and so to put together, okay, centuries of traditions of story, of history, of literature, of myths, mythology, and whatever. The result is a sort of a compression, okay, in his works, okay, and it is obviously extremely difficult for us, okay, for the readers, for those who study his works, to find out every single shade and every single level, okay, in his works. So this is all for today. I hope this has been interesting and useful for you. If you have any questions, if you have any requests, as usual, just leave a comment below. If you find my videos interesting, please subscribe my channel or share my videos. I always say that the more we are, the better we can work together, okay? And so I hope to see you very soon, and we'll go on talking about English literature. Thank you very much and see you soon. Bye!